December 5th, 1928. In the main plaza of Ciénaga, Colombia, several thousand banana workers were waiting. They had come with their families, some of them walking through the night from inland plantations they were not permitted to leave without the company's approval. They were the people who grew and cut and loaded the fruit that filled the cargo ships at Santa Marta, bound for New York and London. They had been on strike for 3 weeks. They had written 9 requests and delivered them formally to the company. 9 requests. A written contract, a 6-day working week, the right to be paid in currency rather than company vouchers. Then, at midnight, General Carlos Cortés Vargas appeared before the assembled crowd and read Decree No. 4 aloud. Under its terms, any gathering of more than 3 persons was prohibited. The workers had 1 minute to disperse. They did not disperse. Then the soldiers raised their rifles. The official record of what happened in that plaza has been disputed ever since. The Colombian government's count named the dead in the dozens. But a young congressional deputy named Jorge Eliécer Gaitán traveled into the banana zone the following year, gathered testimony from survivors, and delivered his findings to the Colombian Congress in September 1929. His speech named what the official record had been constructed to conceal. The government tried to suppress it. But the story does not start in Ciénaga. 29 years before the troops assembled in that plaza, the company that would send them there was 2 years old and still learning what it could become. The United Fruit Company was formed in 1899 from a merger between the Boston Fruit Company and the Central American concerns of a man named Minor Cooper Keith. The Boston side had spent the 1880s and 1890s building a Caribbean banana trade in a fruit that most Americans had barely encountered, importing it from Jamaica and Cuba, selling it in a market they were simultaneously creating. Keith had built railways across Costa Rica on terms so favorable to himself that by the end of the process, he had accumulated vast tracts of Central American land and an intimate understanding of how to make a tropical government do what he needed. His partners in Boston had the market. Keith had the infrastructure to move the fruit. Together, they formed a company. It came to Colombia. Beginning in the first years of the 20th century, UFC established itself in the Santa Marta banana zone, along the Caribbean coast of the Magdalena Department. The Colombian government offered land concessions in exchange for development. UFC accepted. It built a railroad connecting the inland plantations to the port at Santa Marta. It strung telegraph lines across the zone. It raised company towns with company-built housing, company hospitals, and company commissary stores. It employed its own guards and ran a private police force alongside the Colombian state authorities. By the late 1920s, the Santa Marta banana zone stretched across roughly 250 miles of Colombia's Caribbean coast. Inside it, the United Fruit Company functioned, in most of the ways that mattered to the people who lived there, as the government. The Colombian state existed at its edges. The workers who cultivated that territory did not receive wages in the ordinary sense. The company paid its workers in vouchers, printed chits denominated in company currency, redeemable at the commissary stores that stood beside every barracks, every loading dock, every junction on the company's rail lines. The voucher worked inside the banana zone. Outside it, the voucher was paper. A worker who wanted to send money home to family in another part of Colombia, who wanted to spend his earnings in a town the company did not own, found that his wages existed only in a form the company could honor and the company could revoke. Judith White, in her 1978 study of UFC's Colombian operations, describes the commissary system as one in which the worker was bound to the zone, not by statute, but by the denomination of his earnings. The zone was open. The worker was technically free to leave. His wages could not travel with him. Other conditions built on this foundation. The workday was long. The week had no guaranteed day of rest. Workers injured on the job accessed company hospitals, where treatment was charged against their future earnings. The labor arrangements in the zone were organized through subcontracting, systems that allowed the company to maintain, in any official accounting, that the man holding the machete in the plantation row was not its direct employee. If he was not the company's employee, his injury was not the company's liability. His death would not appear in any company ledger. In a few years, the people who were organizing those workers would understand exactly what that structure was built to accomplish. For a while, the zone operated in the quiet of its own logic. Things seemed workable from the company's perspective and from the government's. That did not last. Raúl Eduardo Mahecha had arrived in the Magdalena Banana Zone by the mid-1920s. He was a labor organizer with a long record of union activity across Colombia, a socialist in the tradition of the Latin American labor movements that had been growing since the early years of the century. He understood the enclave economy. He had seen its architecture before: the private currency, the company store, the land grant that became a sealed world with its own rules and its own arithmetic. He knew that the only leverage a worker inside that structure possessed was the labor itself, and that leverage only worked if the workers could hold it together long enough to matter. He helped organize what would become the Banana Workers Union in the Magdalena Zone. The work was patient and deliberately quiet. Meetings were held away from company property. Workers were recruited carefully. In the hours the company's guards were occupied elsewhere. The company would later characterize this organizing as a communist conspiracy, a phrase that would travel upward through the Colombian government and into the diplomatic cables of American officials in Bogotá. In the historical record, the organizing looks more like a very long and careful patience. By late 1928, the union had enough members to stop. Mahecha would look back on what he had built in those years and understand, from inside a military jail in Santa Marta, what the company had decided to do with it. And this is where the year takes its darkest turn. On November 12, 1928, workers across the Santa Marta Banana Zone set down their tools and walked off the plantations. Estimates of how many struck run from 12,000 to more than 30,000. They had compiled 9 demands and submitted them formally to the United Fruit Company. A written employment contract, a 6-day working week with Sundays off, payment in cash, sanitary conditions in worker housing, medical care that would not be charged against their wages, an end to the subcontracting system that denied workers any direct relationship with the company that owned the land, the railroad, the hospital, and the stores where their vouchers were good. The United Fruit Company's response was not a counteroffer. It was a message delivered to the Colombian government, carrying an implication the Colombian government could not afford to misread. The strike represented a threat to American investment in Colombia. If it was not broken, UFC might have to reconsider its presence in the country. UFC's operations generated export revenue that the Colombian government depended on, and the company knew the government knew it. The threat was credible precisely because everyone involved had done the arithmetic. That was the version the Colombian public saw. Behind it, a second pressure was already in motion. Jefferson Caffrey, the United States Minister to Colombia in 1928, had communicated to the Colombian Foreign Ministry that the United States expected the Colombian government to protect American lives and American property. The workers' movement had been characterized in diplomatic correspondence as driven by outside radical agitators, a framing that served the company's interest in having the state treat a labor dispute as a security matter. The Colombian government, dependent on UFC's revenues and attentive to American diplomatic signals, heard the signal clearly. President Miguel Abadia Méndez authorized the military response. General Carlos Cortés Vargas was given command. In the days before December 5th, Mahecha was arrested. The precise date of his detention is not certain across all surviving accounts. What is clear from the record is that by the night the troops assembled in Ciénaga, the man who had spent years building the union that called the strike was held in a military jail in Santa Marta, 40 miles from the plaza where his members were still waiting for an answer that was not coming. December 5th, 1928, Ciénaga, the main plaza. The workers had held the plaza for days. Eyewitness accounts, gathered later by Gaitán, describe families in the crowd, women who had come because they believed the visible presence of civilians would carry some weight against what the gathering darkness was making increasingly plain. The strike had held for 3 weeks. The 9 demands had received no formal response. The workers had the plaza and each other, and the slow passage of nights. Shortly after midnight, General Cortés Vargas appeared before the assembled crowd and read Decree No. 4. The proclamation, issued hours earlier, declared martial law across the Santa Marta zone. Any assembly of more than 3 persons was illegal. The crowd was ordered to disperse. In his own memoir, Los Sucesos de las Bananeras, published in 1929, Cortés Vargas states that the crowd was given 1 minute to comply. They did not comply. Then the soldiers fired. The shooting lasted several minutes. Workers ran toward the train station and the streets leading out of the plaza. Accounts gathered in subsequent investigations describe bodies in the square and in the surrounding streets, and accounts of firing continuing at the train station where workers had taken shelter. Cortés Vargas wrote the account of that night himself. He describes the order he gave, the moment the firing began, the chaos that followed, and the result he achieved. He describes it as a necessary restoration of order in a zone where American investment had created Colombian prosperity and where that investment was under threat. He wrote his memoir within a year of the event, while his memory was fresh and his confidence in his decision was apparently intact. He does not, in that memoir, name a number for the dead. If anyone expected the Colombian government to supply that number independently and honestly, they would need to have been unfamiliar with how the Colombian government had framed its role from the first cable onward. If this is the kind of history you think more people should know, subscribe now and stay with this. What came next is the part that the official account was built to prevent. While the plaza of Ciénaga was being cleared, while testimony gathered later by Gaitán would describe company rail cars being used to remove bodies from the zone in the days that followed, a different accounting was being composed in Bogotá. The Colombian government issued its official statement. The death toll in that initial report was kept low. The figure most frequently cited in subsequent historical scholarship as the government's acknowledged number is roughly 47 dead across all incidents of the strike suppression, though the primary government documents of the period have been reported differently across sources, and the figure varies depending on which incident and which date is being measured. The army had restored order. The strike was broken. The United Fruit Company remained in Colombia. 8 months later, a different account was delivered to the Colombian Congress. Jorge Eliécer Gaitán was 29 years old in 1928. He was a congressional deputy, a lawyer educated in Italy under the criminologist Enrico Ferri, and the kind of politician who understood that what a government chooses not to count reveals more than what it counts. He traveled to the Banana Zone in 1929 and spent months there. He spoke to workers, to widows, to men who had been in the plaza that night and who kept their accounts private because speaking openly put them at risk of losing their employment in the zone or their freedom to remain in it. He gathered testimony. He documented the discrepancy between the government's count and the number of missing persons registered in the communities around Ciénaga. In September 1929, Gaitán stood before the Colombian Congress and delivered a speech naming what the official record had been constructed to conceal. The precise figures he cited in that speech have themselves been the subject of historical debate in the decades since. He described casualties far exceeding the government's account. Subsequent historians, including Judith White in her 1978 study, and the American labor historian Charles Bergquist in his 1986 work, Labor in Latin America, have examined the surviving evidence and concluded that the true death toll exceeded the official figure and cannot now be verified precisely from the records that remain. The range in scholarship runs from scores of dead to potentially hundreds. The records were not preserved in a form that would permit an accurate count. They were not designed to be. The government tried to suppress Gaitán's congressional speech. This is documented. The suppression attempt is part of the political record of the period. We do not know the names of the workers who died in the plaza at Ciénaga on the night of December 5, 1928. The absence of those names was deliberate. Bodies were moved before any independent count could be conducted. The government's figure was kept low. The company's labor arrangements had been structured, specifically and deliberately, so that the man holding the machete was not on paper the company's employee. If he was not the company's employee, his death generated no record the company was obligated to keep. The commissary chits he had been paid in would simply go unredeemed. Few people who encounter this story have come across this part. The architecture of the labor system and the architecture of the cover-up were the same architecture, built at the same time for related purposes. Raúl Eduardo Mahicha was eventually released from detention. The union he had spent years building was gone. The workers who remained in the zone returned to the plantations, to the voucher system, to the 6-day week without Sundays that had been the first item on their list of 9 requests. Mahicha continued organizing elsewhere in Colombia, in oil fields, in mines, in the other industries where the same enclave economy reproduced itself with different commodities and the same arithmetic of control. He died in 1945. The historical record gives him a date of death and a political file. It does not give him what the workers he organized most wanted: acknowledgement, by someone with the authority to give it, that what was taken from them was real and deliberate. But the account of this event that reached the widest audience was not Gaitán's congressional testimony. It was a novel. In 1967, Gabriel García Márquez published 100 años de soledad, known in English as 100 Years of Solitude. The novel is set in the fictional town of Macondo, which bears an unmistakable relationship to the Aracataca of García Márquez's childhood, a town in the Magdalena department at the center of the old banana zone. In the novel, the banana company massacres 3,000 workers and loads their bodies onto rail cars that carry them to the sea. The image entered world literature. The book won the Nobel Prize in 1982. For millions of readers, the novel became the authoritative account. It is fiction. García Márquez never claimed it was history. The historical record offers a different and more contested picture. The Colombian government acknowledged dozens dead. Gaitán's investigation indicated many more. Scholars who have examined the surviving evidence have placed the true toll higher than the official count, while acknowledging they cannot put a precise figure on it. The scholarly range runs from scores to potentially hundreds. The 3,000 dead in García Márquez is the scale of the crime as a novelist renders it, drawn from the moral truth of what was done, and not from a document anyone was allowed to keep. The commissary system, among other things, had been built to ensure that losses of this kind could not be given a precise value the company would have to honor. The massacre did not damage the United Fruit Company's immediate position in Colombia. The company continued operating in the Santa Marta banana zone for decades after 1928. But what it damaged was something less visible and more durable: the ability of the Colombian government and American diplomatic officials to maintain that accommodating American corporate interests was a neutral economic arrangement with no body count attached. The plaza at Ciénaga became a reference point in Colombian political discourse. In congressional speeches, in the education of a generation of labor organizers, in the conversations that would eventually shape the governments across Latin America that chose to push back against American corporate presence in the mid-20th century, what happened in Ciénaga on December 5, 1928, was cited and named and returned to. Everything the United Fruit Company had built in the Magdalena zone was, slowly, beginning to work against it. UFC left the Santa Marta banana zone in 1965, driven out by a combination of labor unrest, soil exhaustion, disease, and economic shifts that the original concession model could not absorb. By then, the company had been under sustained antitrust pressure in the United States for more than a decade. The name did not survive the century. UFC became Chiquita Brands International, a different name over a recognizable structure. Jorge Eliécer Gaitán did not live to see any of it. He became one of Colombia's most significant political figures in the 1940s, the leader of the Liberal Party's popular wing, and he built his career in the argument he had first made in the Congress in 1929, that the lives of ordinary Colombians deserved to appear in the same accounting as American investment. On April 9, 1948, Gaitán was shot on a Bogotá street. His assassination triggered the civil conflict Colombians call La Violencia, which killed an estimated 200,000 people over the following decade. And this is the part where the comfortable distance between then and now closes. Here is the compressed sequence of what occurred in the Santa Marta banana zone between 1899 and 1929. A company built an enclave with a license from a government that needed the revenue. The enclave paid its workers in a currency only the enclave could honor. The workers asked for a written contract, a day off, and wages they could spend in the world outside the company's fence. The company told the Colombian government this was subversion. The Colombian government received signals from Washington that the United States expected Colombia to protect American investment. It sent soldiers. The soldiers fired on a crowd that included women and children. The official record named the dead in the dozens. The congressional investigation said many more had died. The bodies were moved before any independent count could be conducted. We do not know the names of everyone who died. Raúl Eduardo Mahecha was in a jail in Santa Marta when the shooting started. He was never given a verified count. No one was. The count was not made available by the people who held the authority to make it available. It has not been established with certainty since. Gaitán, who stood before the Congress and named what the official record had been built to conceal, was killed in 1948. What he said in 1929 is in the archive. The banana sitting on your kitchen counter was grown somewhere that has its own version of this arithmetic. Wages, working conditions, the right to organize without the company calling it a threat to investment. The form of the arrangement changes across time and geography. The structure that underlies it is recognizable from 1928. The real question in this story is not whether what happened in Ciénaga was a massacre. The documents that survive are clear enough on that. The question this story leaves is why, in December 1928, the Colombian government made the calculation it made. Why the lives of the workers assembled in that plaza weighed less, in the official accounting, than the cable from the American minister in Bogota and the threat from UFC to take its railroad and go home. The answer the historical record returns is one that the 20th century repeated often enough to begin to feel like a law of economics. It was not a law. It was a choice, made by specific people with specific reasons on a specific night. Documented in cables and memoirs and congressional suppression orders that are now, in some cases, open to anyone who looks. The names of the people who made that choice are in the record. The reasons they gave are in the record. The choice they made is in the record. The names of the workers in the plaza are not. Subscribe if this is the kind of history you want more of, and leave a comment with a question this video left unanswered. Those are the ones worth following into the archive. If the pattern of a company and a government making that calculation together feels like it predates 1928, it does, by centuries. There is a video on this channel that follows it to 1621, to a set of islands smaller than Manhattan, to a spice company that erased an entire people from the islands they had lived on for generations, and left no one who could contest the count afterward. That video is called The Nutmeg That Wiped Out an Entire People. It is on the end card right now. Tap it and keep watching.